Thank you everyone for joining us in person and online again for our next session of the Founder University of Nevada series to talk about supply chain and inventory management. And this is part of the product validation bootcamp for July. So a little bit about Robyn. Robyn is a global logistics management and sales executive with an extensive and very diverse experience driving from the acceleration of marketing and sales growth. She's successfully developed and managed strategic sales and supply management initiatives for global brands, including a number of Fortune 500 companies. And she is considered a leader in the sales, marketing, logistics space and is actively engaged in women's leadership development, coaching, and mentoring activities, of which we are very happy to have her here today for that. And then we're really looking forward to hearing from you, but thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Again, it's Robyn Brunscher. I tease everyone and I say my last name is all three meals and they tend to not forget it after that. My current role with the University of Nevada, Reno is Director of Supply Chain and Transportation Management. My responsibilities there are to expose students to the world of supply chain. And a lot of folks really didn't associate supply chain in their everyday life until COVID hit. So it's about much more than toilet paper. So I'm happy to share some of that information today. And today's presentation, I'm bringing you a survey that was done very recently by a company that touches just about every industry that matters. And so let me get started here, and I'm going to introduce you to Grainger Inc. So they typically were known, years ago by the name W.W. Grainger, unless you had or were working in an industrial environment, a manufacturing environment, you may not have ever heard about W.W. Grainger. But they are, first of all, they're a $13 billion company. Their stats here are pretty impressive. If you take a look, especially from active customers and suppliers. So when we talk about supply chain, and I know all of you are entrepreneurs and you're starting your businesses, just managing the number of suppliers, depending on your product, is one of the biggest tasks as part of your supply chain. So let's look at these numbers real quick. 3.5 million customers, 5,000 suppliers selling 1.6 million products. 25,000 team members seems low to manage this type of global entity, but they were my customer at one time, and I can tell you that they run mean and lean. And I'll give you an example here in a moment of how I worked with them. They have 537 retail locations around the globe. They do hit every major market, including what we call EMEA or the EU. They are in Asia Pac. And then I'll give you an example, in addition to those retail locations, how they get product to their customers. Grainger does not manufacture anything. They are strictly a distributor of industrial grade supplies and safety products. So you could imagine during COVID, they were pretty busy with items of safety that were required to continue manufacturing in both the US and abroad. They also serve, as you look down there at the bottom, there's 18 examples of the industries that they service. And hopefully when I send out the survey at the end of this presentation to all of you, excuse me, I'll also send out a video that is really fun to watch. It's what they did for the Chicago Cubs. And I didn't want to take time during this presentation to show it, but I will definitely send it to you as part of that. When I think of inventory management and I think of supply chain, this company probably has the most complex outbound. And what I mean by that is just the sheer number of locations and the sheer product type that they tailor to each of these industries. So let me give you an example of a project that I worked on with them, and then you can kind of get a feel for the complexity of what they do. Construction. So in the construction field, if you were to even think about Reno as an example of putting up a warehouse, typically what happens is the slab is poured on the grounds or the land of where they're going to erect that building. Grainger comes in very early with the primary or the main contractor, and they actually stock a trailer. So what they do is they put all their parts in a trailer, they secure that trailer to the job site, and then once the subcontractors start to come in and do the work, all the materials and the parts and the technology that's required to erect that building are stored in that trailer. So as the subcontractors come in, they go to the trailer, the primary contractor will keep track of what's being used. All of that goes into a system, and then Grainger will come in and restock those products depending on how long the job takes to complete that building in its entirety. The company was actually started with an electrician in mind. The electricians and the plumbers are typically the first ones on site once the foundation has been poured. And now this company has grown into support all of those industries that you see below, which is extremely impressive. So let me jump into their survey, and this was completed at the end of 2022. So their survey is going out. They had 303 supply chain managers that responded to this survey, so across all the industries. And there were 4 main questions asked. So we're going to go through all 4 of those. So what were the greatest concerns for the supply chain? And it didn't have to be following COVID, but the timing of the survey naturally lended itself to the following COVID, which we all know in supply chain was not a great time for us. Before we start reading some of the feedback, there's a reference to MRO. And so MRO stands for maintenance, repair, and operations. And that's really who they cater to within any of the industries and any of the companies that they serve. So let me roll these up for you so we don't go through them one by one. The first one really is financial. And you can see there's financial concerns on both sides, supply chain as a whole and inventory management. Rising prices of materials, budget constraints, and a potential recession was looming at the time that the survey took place. Just to give you an idea, the average building material price increased 20.4% year over year in 2022, and have also risen 33% since the pandemic, okay, since the start of the pandemic. So let me bring that into light for you and just as a consumer. As a consumer, we all spent a lot of time at home. My husband happens to be in commercial construction, so it's easy for me to speak to the materials that were used during that time. And just the cost of lumber alone caused consumers not to do material improvements in their homes during COVID, right? Now you can imagine that at a global scale or a commercial level where they're trying to erect a building and the cost of lumber, in addition to the cost of industrial materials, was skyrocketing. So there's good news at the end of this survey. The next topic that came up as part of this was operational. So you can see a couple of operational issues there: back orders, product availability and inventory management, and then delivery time, right? That was another issue that came out of COVID. If I were to look at the ports, we all know what happened there. If I were to look at the shipping companies, UPS, FedEx, DHL, the big boys, they did a pretty good job considering what was happening during COVID. Nobody at those companies were out of work. They were considered essential workers. And if you go back and take a look at the profits for those companies, they were huge during the COVID, and probably 21 to 22 were their highest profit margins. There are some very simple formulas, and I'll be happy to share these as well when I send you the survey, for determining your baseline inventory. So if you haven't had the experience of doing that yet, I'll be happy to give you that. But if you'll notice, on this particular slide, they were talking about buffer inventory, right? What is it that they need to do to make sure they have enough inventory or product availability? That was a #1 concern about back orders. Buffer inventory, you're going to see it mentioned here a couple of times during the presentation. We use a rule of thumb to 10 to 15% of additional inventory to buffer. Now, we do get into some additional formulas about your highest selling product or your most popular product. And again, I'll send those formulas to you. And let's jump down to the last two, which is security and labor retention. So labor, especially during COVID, was in high demand. We could not hire enough people to help make up for the inefficiencies in supply chain management. That was a huge concern. But just to give you a couple of numbers, when you're thinking about your businesses, your labor expense should weigh about 40 to 50% of your entire cost, okay? So make note of that number. We'll talk about what type of labor as we go forward here that is probably the most important when you're setting your businesses up currently. Let me go on to this one. The next question that the survey asked was, what changes are you making in the supply chain? So look at that 68%. 68% of the respondents were concerned about the suppliers not having enough product from a manufacturing standpoint, and they wanted to add alternate suppliers. Now, that's great for starting up a business and having, in addition to your buffer inventory, having those additional suppliers. However, it'll completely contradict the fourth item there, which says deeper relationships with your current partners, right? So there has to be a balance between adding alternate suppliers and actually deepening those relationships with your existing suppliers. Now, anybody who started their business before COVID and after COVID has a baseline by which they can determine where they really fell down the hardest. But if you're starting a business, this is good information to know that you can make sure you've got an alternate supplier. You can negotiate accordingly. And adding those additional suppliers actually could give you a better price point, depending on who you prioritize as supplier A and supplier B. Better visibility, you can see is high on the list there. I can tell you, after working for companies and working on projects for healthcare visibility of high value goods, like insulin, for example. When you think about tracking or visibility within the supply chain, if you think about tracking a package through UPS as an example, it's really deductive reasoning. And let me explain that for just a moment. When a package is scanned, when it leaves point of origin and it is headed to the point of destination, the scanning that gets done is deductive. What it means is that the package has now arrived at a location that tells you that it made it through the first 3 locations. It is not proactive visibility. Proactive visibility would be like following your food on Uber, or following your Uber driver, where you can see it going through the course of the sort and delivery. The delivery companies are not there yet. They are basically focusing on high value goods for that type of technology, but your toilet paper and your cheaper items coming from Amazon typically will not get that type of technology into that package movement. The dollar and the profit just is not there yet. The comment over here, Alan Ambling is a close friend of mine and a supply chain expert, and I worked at UPS with him. And I just love this comment about a diversified supplier base. So make sure that when you are diversifying, that you are not spending too much as a result of that, right? The challenge is you're not going to get a volume discount if you put too many suppliers in, but what you might want to do is, again, supplier A, supplier B, and make sure that you're clear on that type of relationship that you're building. The last thing here is kind of a new, I shouldn't say it's completely new, but the prioritization for ESG is growing stronger and stronger. So an example would be when you're contracting with your suppliers, ask them, if you're putting bids out for cost, ask them if they have an ESG component. It is important for you as a company owner to express that to your buyers on behalf of your suppliers. So an example would be, how do they use energy and other resources? How do they get rid of their waste? How do they know what their carbon emissions are, right? So those are just some examples of when you go to build these relationships with your suppliers, that you are not just thinking about cost or price. Okay, this will get you a long way with your customer base and your contracts. Okay, the third question. The third question was, what emerging technologies are you grasping onto? And I know this chart's a little blurry, so I'm going to walk you through it. And let's face it, everywhere you turn, it's all about the data, no matter what, right? You have to have the data in order to run an efficient supply chain. We've talked about blockchain. Maybe I'll address some of those questions at the end of the presentation and why that isn't where we thought it would be by this time. When we look at a company's technology, and I could use 100 examples here, but what companies look at is, if it's working, they may not invest into newer technology, right? So everybody has a different demand. Data capture and new technology are two different things. I've always said during my career, I could probably run a warehouse on an index card if I had to, but of course, that's not the way we want to do business. When you look at a company who is getting ready to invest into new technology, it is typical that the current technology in place was a result of the best decision at that time. And so whenever you're dealing with industrial companies, as an example, like Granger, it's typical of their clients to have very choppy technology. It's typical that they've collected or created proprietary systems that now have to be linked together. They don't necessarily go in and install a complete ERP if in fact the industrial environment is working for them. So just know that. In my years of bringing customer solutions, I've seen this over and over again, especially in the industrial sector. They're kind of cobbled and inefficient when it comes to technology. Now, if we think about companies that are on the verge of technology, Amazon, for example, is a technological company. It's a technological supply chain, okay? When it comes to putting the technology in, we have to start learning how to take that 40 and 50% of labor and making sure that we have the right skills in place to operate and manage that technology coming in, right? Everybody wants it. Everybody wants to have the cutting edge, but if we keep hiring in an old-fashioned operational way, we may not be able to stay in front of that emerging technology the way we really need to. So this quote over here, I'm going to tell you that I'm a perfect example of this. So people are retiring and the new people coming in don't have a lot of the same knowledge, skills, and experience. And I'm going to finish that sentence by saying in supply chain management, right? They may be thinking, if my tool crib attendant who's been here for 30 years has this knowledge in their head about what we manage and how we buy material, what do I do when they retire? So a perfect example of that is myself. When you work in supply chain, a lot of the companies, this was true for UPS and UPS Supply Chain Solutions, they encourage you to retire when you're 55. That's a very old school methodology. It's an old school methodology based on the fact that you get too expensive over the age of 50. Now, if you're looking at Social Security, there's a huge gap there, right? Between 55 and 65 or 67 and a half now when you become eligible. What do you do with all of that knowledge and talent? And typically what happens are we go out and we consult with companies on that transition and handoff. So there are a lot of us out in the field now between the ages of 55 and 67 that are helping companies with the base knowledge of supply chain management and then bringing in new talent on the emerging technologies. So it's something to think about. I say this to you as entrepreneurs because getting a consultant, when I talk about consulting, I'm not talking about the big firms. They're expensive and they're always looking for their next job. What I'm talking about is getting somebody that is skilled in the type of business that you are launching. They've had probably success in it before. They can tell you the way things used to be done and the way things need to be done now, because these emerging technologies haven't failed enough to write a textbook on them yet, right? So we're in a very exciting time. The horizon says that it's limitless. We're going to be able to capture all this. And also, you must know that technologies move very quickly. And so you don't want a dinosaur trying to tell you how technologies are going to change the world, because typically they can't keep up with the speed, but you want to mix that knowledge with a younger and I'll brag on my students. You want to grab those graduates that are able to help you go forward. Okay, the last question, and I'm just watching my time here, so that we can allow for Q&A. The last question was, how does your industry outlook weigh going forward? Now, keep in mind, we've talked about a recession. That has started to turn around now. The rising prices, the 20.5% and 33% increases in material and parts and manufacturing. How are you going to predict your growth over the next year? And so this included years 22 to 23 and 23 and beyond. And I think this looks extremely optimistic. I like what I see here. I had to giggle just a little bit because the government and higher education seem to be a little overstated in my mind, and that has to do with budgets and state, federal budgets that run those programs. But you can see that the word analytics is all over the place here, right? That goes back to my statement of a minute ago that says it's all about the data. Right? Everybody has to capture the data. So Granger made it, also commented here that real-time inventory data combined with good logistics will have the greatest impact on how they manage their supply chain, right? That goes back to visibility. There could be some opportunities for them to get out of that deductive reasoning and know that a trailer is on its route to a particular construction site. That's what they're talking about there. Is it important to evaluate AI and machine learning in your business? My question to all of you would be, is it really necessary yet, right? If you were getting ready to take a look at technology in the form of inventory and order management, if it's part of the design of the software, which everyone's going to say that it is at this point to be the first, then it automatically comes with it. It becomes an element that you can use later or as part of the inventory, as part of inventory and product management. You may not need to use that particular component yet. You can also see the adoption of robotics lands in healthcare. And the reason for that is because of the acceleration of the distribution model and the transportation model during COVID. So when I worked in healthcare, I can tell you that my teams managed all of the companies that produced the COVID vaccine. I retired before that happened, and I couldn't imagine what those floors must have looked like. But they had to incorporate robotics in order to meet the global demand of the vaccines at the time. So they probably thrust it into it knowing very little about it. And if you're familiar with robotics at all, especially when it comes to pick-pack type of distribution environment, those robotics have to learn over time. So it is a machine learning when you put robotics into a warehouse. And I'm sure that the Pfizers and the Medtronics of the world couldn't get those robots to learn fast enough. So depending on your product, and I'd love to hear when we get to the Q&A what some of your products are, but depending on your product and service, you can see the priority being placed on what type of technology is most important. And so again, you'll get a copy of the survey and you can kind of find your way through this matrix to see what really is most important. Analytics goes without saying, but as you get down to the bottom, is it more important for you to focus on programming, or is it more important for you to hire somebody with soft skills and let them do the programming over time? So we're going to go to the last slide here. Those were the main questions that were being asked of the clients. You have a really good sense of the industries that have responded, whether they're responsible for manufacturing or distribution or healthcare manufacturing. Number one, again, increase the number of suppliers they purchase from. So again, don't make it just, I need 100 suppliers. Make sure that you're considering who your A, B, and C suppliers are, and then build those relationships accordingly. 44% on the buffer inventory. Again, I'll give you a formula for that. Hopefully when you do that formula against your baseline inventory, that it'll shake out to be somewhere around 10 to 15%. And that 10 to 15% is going to have to carry through in your costing. So that's something kind of post-COVID that we didn't do before. All right. This feedback, again, keep in mind, this is feedback from companies across those industries that spend at least over $500,000 annually on these supplies. You are probably definitely not there yet, but it is, if you have hopes and dreams to be one of those large companies, this will give you a feel for what they're doing on an annual basis. I like this one, especially with implementing continuous education. And so I work with a lot of companies, a lot of big companies here in the Reno business community that put this as a real high priority, and I love it. Companies, I think in the old days, we used to call it rotation. I know at UPS, I had to hold a multitude of titles, whether it was operational, sales, marketing, etc. Now, rather than rotating people necessarily as part of that continuing education as a demand, it becomes now more of an exposure. And so implementing continuous education for all employees, if it does include rotation, is a priority. The supply chain is becoming functioning in a way that you have to have your resources and your human resources skilled in various areas. It's not enough to have a bunch of experts lined up and transitioning within the supply chain. You have to have a more well-rounded labor force. And that supports the next statistic there, that 53% of the kind of skills needed to adapt to the technologies that are coming in. All right. Down there, you just see a prioritization. Again, keep in mind that this is an industrial environment. This represents manufacturing. It represents government. It represents healthcare. So real-time inventory would supersede machine learning at this point. That's really what it's telling you. Real-time inventory data and logistics are number 1 and 2. And then the new skills, analytics, just like we saw on the previous technology slide, analytics is number 1. AI we're learning about and so on. So those are the key takeaways out of this survey. Again, it's about a 28-page survey, and I'm happy to send that out to everyone. So I'm just going to flip to the next screen here and open it up for questions.
From Clevin, I have a customized shoe that is built for comfort called Trophies. With the cost of production increases and China planning to change their currency, what would be a proactive solution in launching this product?
First of all, I love shoes. So thank you for doing another shoe business. I don't know if that's men or women's shoes, but there is a lot of success to my earlier response, and that is to try and do as much nearshoring as possible. I will include, and I'll make a note here, I'll include a couple of examples of some US manufacturing of shoes designed in Europe. So it may be something to consider. If not a consideration, then my recommendation would be to make sure that whoever's manufacturing that shoe or that product, one, that you have a similar manufacturing backup, one of the things that concerns me the most is we could run into another pandemic. And then if your manufacturing only exists in China, you're completely shut down. So that was a big lesson that we learned. I would say diversify your manufacturing as well as diversifying your inventory.
Awesome, thank you. The next question from Benjamin. You quoted 40 to 50% for the cost of labor for a supply chain company. What percentage is used for hiring and retention? And do you have an average cost spend by supply chain company to find and hire new talent?
Okay, so I think I understand the question, and maybe it's the difference between operational and management labor. So typically within a supply chain operation, when they're referring to 40 to 50%, they're really talking about the operational labor to meet demand. If you're, let's just say you keep it at 40%, which is lean, then you can reallocate 10% of that allocation up to a management role for new soft skills.
And Ben, feel free to put elucidate in the chat if that answers that. I believe then the next part of this question, do you have numbers and stats to show how much the supply chain loses in revenue or sales due to not having enough workers? Oh, interesting.
That's something that I can easily provide. However, off the top of my head, I'm going to say, I'm going to go back to the old rule of, if you do not receive your product due to a poor supply chain, it's going to go right back to the rule of thumb that if someone is dissatisfied with a product or delivery or supply chain delivery, they're going to tell 10 people, right? So depending on the percentage of the volume that you're putting through your facility or that you're selling, I would say that your loss could be tenfold of one order due to poor supply chain delivery. The other thing that consumers are very savvy about, depending on the product that's being referred here, is that we have this expectation about, or we had the expectation about a 2-day delivery. We don't have that expectation any longer due to COVID, which I think is a good thing. It was a silver lining that came out of that. However, what customers and consumers are looking for is the delivery at the right time, that fits them, which is almost harder to do than a 2-day delivery standard. So when you're putting your products together, think about that. Think about the options that you have to give your clients, to give them a better experience over a faster delivery.
One more from Ben. Generally thinking, do supply chain companies do a good job with data capture?
They do. So most of your supply chain companies that are actually selling solutions are running on Oracle ERPs and have been for quite some time. So if I use UPS as an example, they're considered a supply chain company from inception to delivery. And what I mean by that is they're going to come in and reconfigure an organization's supply chain in its entirety, from manufacturing all the way through to consumer delivery. The ERP and the systems that companies like that use are completely integrated with the client, and then all the way through being the last mile delivery, they're tagging into what we consider to be that request for visibility. So again, if you're selling items that are not high value, then you're going to get that supply chain, order management, manufacturing, all the way through to point of delivery with deductive reasoning. If you are a Pfizer and you are manufacturing in New Jersey and you're having to send $40,000 vials of pharmaceutical ingredient, then you're going to tap into an ERP system, typically Oracle or SAP, and you're going to have visibility of that all the way through a proactive technology that can even, and I worked on a project for this, proactive delivery that you can see arriving in a mailroom at a hospital and being carried all the way up to the 4th floor. So I don't know if this, I don't think this group, I'm going to take a guess, wouldn't require that level of technology yet, but it is out there and it is available.
But Robyn, regardless, thank you so much. Clearly a complex, kind of multifaceted component, and we really appreciate your insight on this. Everyone, so thank you all for joining us in person and online, and we will be excited to have you next week for a double session with Peter Ciula on manufacturing and Alex Medic on understanding product viability. There is now Founder University access online. All the members that are here today or have signed up for the program have access to our online portal, and you can access the recording, additional materials, and a number of other items. And also, we have been told to give a reminder that all attendees who come get at least 70% of these sessions will get help getting set up on Deal Room. Deal Room is a great way for you to plug in and find out what resources are in this ecosystem, as well as if they're investors, service providers, other startups. So please go check them out. I think it's vegas.dealroom.co and take a look at that. But it's a new tool that the ecosystem is using. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see everyone next week.